Emilio Verano's hands were shaking, and that alone should have terrified him more than any bullet ever had. He was standing in his private satellite office in a downtown skyscraper, a fortress of black oak and Italian leather, where even his most trusted Lieutenant Franco had to knock 3 times before entering, and tonight the room felt less like a sanctuary and more like a coffin. In front of him, the military-grade security monitor cast a cold blue glow across his face, waiting for one final password, one final keystroke that would either confirm his worst nightmare or set it free. He loosened the knot of his silk tie, the same tie he'd worn to a sit-down with 3 crime families that morning without flinching. But now it felt like a noose tightening around his throat, because this wasn't about territory or money or blood debts. This was about his children. Emilio Verano, 37 years old, the man who ran the south side of Chicago's underworld with an iron fist, the man whose name made grown men stammer and look away, was afraid, genuinely, bone-deep afraid, and it was the kind of fear that only a father who'd already buried his wife could understand. Just 24 hours ago, he'd ordered a second surveillance system installed throughout the mansion. Cameras the size of a pinhead hidden inside smoke detectors, behind abstract paintings, even inside the glass eyes of his daughter's teddy bear, all because his fiancée, Regina Ashford, a stunning blonde from one of Chicago's most powerful old money families, had come to him crying the night before, rolling up her silk sleeve to reveal an ugly bruise on her pale arm, whispering that the nanny, that quiet young woman named Julieta Marin, who'd been caring for the twins for 3 months, had attacked her in the kitchen and shoved her against the marble counter. And then Regina had leaned into his chest and whispered the words that detonated every rational thought in his skull. If she'd do this to me, Emilio, imagine what she's doing to Noah and Gianna when you're not home. What if she's someone Kowalski planted inside our walls? That was all it took. The mention of his enemies infiltrating his home, the image of his 18-month-old twins helpless in the hands of a potential spy, it shattered him. He didn't stop to question why the bruise looked oddly symmetrical. Didn't stop to remember that Julieta had never once raised her voice in 3 months. Didn't stop to notice that Regina's tears dried suspiciously fast. He just saw red. He'd wanted to handle it that same night, the way his world handled problems, permanently. But Regina had talked him out of it with chilling logic. You need proof first. You need to see who she's working for. Don't start a war over a mistake. So he'd spent the night installing cameras and the morning humiliating Julieta, ordering her to scrub every inch of the mansion's marble floors on her hands and knees, while wearing rubber gloves so she wouldn't leave fingerprints on his furniture, telling her with a voice cold enough to freeze blood that if he found a single stain when he returned, she shouldn't expect to see tomorrow, and in his world that wasn't a metaphor. Now here he sat, finger hovering over the laptop's enter key, ready to watch the monster reveal itself remotely, ready to give Franco the kill order. He pressed it. The screen split into 4 feeds, and Emilio braced himself for violence, for neglect, for proof that his children were in danger. But what appeared on camera 3, the wide-angle shot of the grand living room bathed in late-afternoon Chicago sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, wasn't a scene of horror. It hit him so hard he had to grab the edge of his mahogany desk to keep from falling to his knees. There, in the center of the cream-colored Persian rug, was Julieta. She was on her knees in her simple gray uniform and white apron, bright yellow rubber gloves still on her hands because she'd been scrubbing his floors exactly as he'd commanded. But she'd stopped. In her right arm she cradled Noah, the boy's tiny head resting against her shoulder, his fingers gripping the edge of her apron, his face perfectly peaceful, completely safe. In her left arm she held Gianna, the little girl's face buried into Julieta's chest, her small hand clutching the collar of the uniform. Searching for warmth, she couldn't find anywhere else in that cold mansion, and Julieta was humming, her eyes half closed, her lips moving in a soft melody, not caring that her knees ached on the hard stone, not caring that she'd been treated like a slave that very morning, not caring about anything except the 2 motherless babies who'd chosen her arms as their refuge. Emilio Verano, the most dangerous man on the south side of Chicago, the man who hadn't shed a single tear at his own wife's funeral, felt a hot, heavy drop roll down his cheek and land on the polished wood of his desk. He'd installed those cameras to catch a monster, and instead he'd found the only proof that mattered, proof of a love so pure and so fierce that it made every dollar in his empire feel like pocket change, a love that he, their own father, had been too blind and too broken to give them. And then, just as the guilt began to crush him, He saw something on the monitor that made his blood run cold for an entirely different reason. The living room door swung open, and Regina walked in, but the woman who entered wasn't the trembling victim who'd cried in his arms last night. She moved like a predator, and the truth, the real truth, was about to explode across that screen in a way that would change Emilio Verano's life forever. If this story's already got your heart pounding, do me a favor and smash that like button so more people can hear it. Share it with someone who needs a good story tonight, and if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now, let's go back to that living room, because what Regina did when she thought no one was watching is something Emilio will never, ever forget. Regina didn't walk into the living room. She slid in like a snake through grass. And Emilio, eyes glued to the monitor from his private downtown office miles away, immediately sensed the difference between the woman on the camera and the woman who'd cried in his arms last night. The cream Valentino dress clung to her like a suit of fashionable armor. The red-soled Louboutins clicked against the marble with a cold, decisive rhythm. The rhythm of someone who believed she owned everything under this roof, including the people inside it. No tears, no sobs, no trembling shoulders, just a glance that swept the room as if she were taking inventory. And a chill ran down Emilio's spine when he realized those eyes had never known fear. Not for a single day since she'd first stepped into the Verano estate. On the other side of the lens, Giulietta reacted in an instant. She didn't need to think, didn't need anyone to command her. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, the way a mother dog instinctively stands between danger and her litter the moment she smells a threat. She set Noah down on the rug beside Gianna so gently the little boy didn't even open his eyes, then stood, smoothed the white apron over her gray uniform, and lowered her head, but her torso shifted sideways by one step, only one, just enough to place her thin body as a shield between Regina and the two children lying on the rug. Emilio noticed it, and his heart clenched, because she'd done it without thinking. Not because she was paid, not because she feared being fired, but because the instinct to protect was carved into every muscle, the way breathing was. "Good afternoon, Miss Ashford," Giulietta said, her voice soft, with a slight tremble at the end. Regina didn't bother to answer. She stopped in the center of the living room, ran one perfect manicured finger along the armchair, checking for dust, then lifted that finger to eye level and examined it as if she were studying a specimen under a microscope. Then she lowered her gaze to Giulietta and smiled in a way Emilio had never seen on her face, the smile of a predator that knew it stood at the top of the food chain and was looking down at prey. "Do you know where you are?" Regina said, her tone light as if she were asking about the weather, but every word carried a blade. "This is the Verano estate, not the South Side slums where you grew up. So when I say clean, it means I don't want to see a single speck of dust. Or is that tiny head of yours too small to hold a simple instruction?" "Yes, ma'am," Giulietta answered, her eyes still fixed on the floor. Emilio's fist tightened on his desk until his knuckles went white, because Regina's voice came through the speakers crystal clear, and he realized that wasn't the voice of a woman traumatized after an attack. It was the voice of someone used to giving orders to people beneath her. Regina walked to the corner where the bucket of soapy water sat against the wall, looked down at the marble floor Giulietta had polished until it gleamed like a mirror all morning on her knees and with her gloved hands, then said, coolly, that the floor still had streaks, before she kicked the side of the bucket with the toe of her red-soled shoe. Soapy water spilled out, spreading across the marble. Giulietta had just cleaned, destroying in 3 seconds what had taken hours of kneeling to achieve. Giulietta drew a short breath, but said nothing. She dropped to her knees at once, reached for the rag beneath Regina's feet, and started blotting the water, her knees and those bright yellow rubber gloves stark against the white stone, an image that made Emilio grind his teeth, because he was the one who'd told her to wear them this morning. And then it happened. While Giulietta was bent over on her knees, wiping up the water right under Regina's feet, Regina lifted her right foot and brought it down. Not a step, not a slip, but a slow, deliberate motion, pressing the sharp heel of her Louboutin into the back of Giulietta's right hand, where it lay flat on the floor. Through the microphone, Emilio heard the heel grind on rubber, and a small hiss escaped Giulietta's throat as she yanked her hand back to her chest, curling in on herself like a wounded animal. But she didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't look up. She only bowed her head lower, as if pain were the price she had to pay to stay, to keep earning money for Rosa's dialysis, to avoid being thrown out on the street one more time. But in the very moment Regina pressed down, Emilio saw what he should have seen last night. To keep her balance while standing on one foot and shifting her weight into that heel, Regina flung her right arm outward, the very arm she'd claimed Julieta had grabbed and shoved into a marble tabletop until it bruised so badly she couldn't move it. That arm now lifted high to shoulder level with the flawless flexibility of a ballet dancer. Not a single flinch, not a single grimace, not the faintest sign of pain existing beneath the silk. Emilio shoved his chair back and shot to his feet, both hands braced on the desk, staring at the screen as the image of Regina's arm moving freely, as if it had never been injured, looped over and over in his mind. The lie didn't collapse slowly. It exploded like bulletproof glass punched through by a shot, and behind it was the raw, sickening truth that the woman he'd shared a bed with for months had just stomped on the hand of the girl he'd nearly ordered killed last night, and that her whole victim act was nothing but a spell cast in a power war, one that he, a notorious Mafia boss, had fallen for like a fool. Julieta was still kneeling on the floor, clutching the stomped hand to her chest, head bowed low, breathing shallow and fast, when little Noah woke up. He'd drifted off on the Persian rug the moment Julieta set him down, but the sharp click of heels and Regina's icy voice had yanked him out of sleep, and now he was sitting up, rubbing his eyes with two tiny fists, looking around the room with that groggy stare that was already searching for what every 18-month-old looks for the second they wake. A familiar face, a smile, a hand reaching out. Noah's eyes moved to Julieta, curled on the ground, then slid to Regina standing tall in the middle of the room. And with the simple, absolute logic of a child who didn't yet know how to sort good from evil, he crawled toward the nearest adult. Emilio saw his son on the screen crawling toward Regina, and every muscle in his body locked tight. He wanted to tear through the monitor, wanted to roar, "No, stop, come back." But all he could do was stand there, gripping the edge of his desk so hard the mahogany creaked under his hands. Noah reached Regina's feet, plopped down beside the red-soled Louboutins, then picked up the little plastic toy car he'd been holding in his sleep and lifted it high, chin tipped up, grinning wide with a mouth that didn't yet have enough teeth, full of the innocent faith that any grown-up would be happy to see his car. He babbled a sound that came out like ka, meaning car, and he waited. He waited for a smile, waited for the adult hand to reach down and take the toy, waited for the wow Julieta always said whenever he showed her anything at all. But what he got wasn't a smile. Regina's scream ripped through the room like shattering glass. "Don't touch me, you filthy thing." And before Emilio could even draw another breath, Regina's hand shoved hard into Noah's shoulder, with all the force of an angry adult crashing into the body of an 18-month-old child who weighed not even 12 kilograms. Noah toppled backward, his back slamming into the marble floor, the toy car flying from his hand and skittering across the room. And the cry that burst from his mouth wasn't the cry of hunger or tiredness, it was the cry of pure terror, the cry of a small creature that couldn't understand why he was hurting when all he'd wanted was to share something joyful. Gianna, lying only a few steps away on the rug, heard her brother cry and reacted with twin instinct, her mouth opening, her face flushing red, and then she screamed too, her wail joining Noah's until the two cries became a painful chorus that filled the living room. Emilio shouted in the study, his fist slamming down on the desk so hard the whiskey glass jumped and spilled across the keyboard. But on the screen, dozens of kilometers away, his son was still on that cold floor he couldn't reach. But someone could. Julieta changed in less than a heartbeat. The girl who'd been kneeling all morning without daring to lift her head, the girl who'd been stomped on without making a sound, the girl who'd swallowed every insult because she needed every dollar to keep her grandmother alive, that girl vanished. What rose from the marble wasn't a nanny anymore. It was something primal with no name in any language except instinct. And it moved faster than any bodyguard Emilio had ever hired. Julieta was at Noah in 2 steps, dropping to her knees beside him, both hands in bright yellow rubber gloves flying over his head, his neck, his back, checking bone, checking scalp, checking everything her half-finished nursing training had drilled into her, her mouth whispering over and over, "Jules is here, you're okay. Jules is here," until she was sure nothing was broken, nothing was bleeding, nothing existed except fear. Then she stood, lifted Noah into her right arm, and he immediately buried his face into her neck like he was diving into a shelter. Her left arm reached back toward Gianna, crying on the rug, shielding her, forming a wall of flesh and bone between 2 children and the woman who'd just shoved a baby to the floor. Emilio saw Julieta's eyes on the screen and his breath caught. They weren't the downcast eyes he'd grown used to over 3 months. They were looking straight at Regina, burning, not a single drop of fear left in them. And in that moment, Emilio realized he was witnessing the most raw, original courage he'd ever seen in his life, braver than any gunman in his organization, because those men had guns, and this girl had nothing but bare hands wrapped in yellow rubber. "You can call me filthy," Giulietta said, and her voice didn't shake. "You can stomp on my hand. You can make me lick this floor if you want. But if you touch the children one more time, I swear to God I won't stand still." Regina's eyes widened in shock, because in 3 months, she'd never heard Giulietta speak more than 2 sentences in a row, and she'd never heard her speak like this, like someone with nothing left to lose. "You dare," Regina snapped, stepping forward, lifting her right hand high, palm open, ready to slap. But Giulietta didn't close her eyes, didn't turn away, didn't flinch. She raised her left hand, the one in that bright yellow glove, up to face level, ready to catch the slap and block it. And she said in a low voice, each word clear, "Do it. But you should know this. For these 2 children, I'm willing to hit back. I've got nothing to lose. You do." Regina's hand hung in the air, trembling, and Emilio saw on the camera what he'd seen hundreds of times in the underworld. The moment a bully realizes the prey isn't afraid anymore, and like every bully from a street thug to a queen in a living room, Regina stepped back. Her hand dropped, but her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred, and she leaned toward Giulietta, lowering her voice into a hiss the microphone caught, syllable by syllable. "You're finished. When Emilio gets back, I'll tell him you shoved the boy. I'll say you hit him. You won't walk out of this house on your own 2 feet. You'll walk out in a body bag, because you know how this house handles problems." Giulietta didn't say another word. She only held Noah tighter, placed a hand on Gianna's head as the little girl crawled to her feet, and stood there in the living room flooded with Chicago afternoon light, like a statue of defiance, 2 children clinging to her like a lifeline, knowing full well that Regina's threat in this house wasn't empty. Regina turned her back on Giulietta, as if the nanny no longer existed. And what happened next on the screen made Emilio realize the woman he'd planned to marry wasn't just a liar. She was an architect of destruction, someone capable of designing both a crime scene and a victim from nothing. Regina walked to the large decorative mirror hanging in the hallway that connected the living room to the main foyer, and what she did in front of that glass made Emilio feel sick with how cold and meticulous it was. First, she lifted both hands to her head and started tearing apart her perfect blonde hair, pulling strands out of place, raking and twisting until it looked like someone had grabbed her hair and yanked hard in a fight. Then she tilted her head, studied the result in the mirror with the evaluating gaze of a director checking a take, and adjusted a few strands so it would look more natural. Next, she pinched hard at the soft flesh above her left arm, right where she'd shown Emilio an old bruise last night, pinching with thumb and forefinger with enough force to turn the skin red, then purple, twisting it, holding it for a few seconds before letting go, checking the result, then pinching again in another spot to make it more convincing. Not flinching, completely calm, as if self-inflicted injury were a skill she'd practiced into mastery. Emilio remembered the bruise from last night, and now he understood why it had looked unnaturally symmetrical, because it hadn't come from being grabbed or shoved. It had been made by her own hands in front of a mirror with the precision of a makeup artist. Then Regina gently tore at the neckline seam of her Valentino dress, just enough to look like it had been tugged in a struggle, but not enough to ruin the structure, and Emilio realized with disgust that even while staging a fake scene, she was still lucid enough to protect the designer piece. That blend of cruelty and vanity made him understand her heart wasn't stone, it was hollow. When she finished dressing the part of the victim, Regina returned to the living room and walked to the side table where an abstract ceramic sculpture sat, one Emilio had bought at an auction in New York. She lifted it with both hands and threw it straight onto the marble floor. The crash blasted through the study speakers like a gunshot. Sharp fragments sprayed in every direction, and one large piece struck Giulietta's shin, slicing through the gray uniform fabric and leaving a long tear, and beneath it, a red line of blood. Giulietta didn't scream. She only turned to shield the children, bending low, using her back as a roof so no shard would fly into Noah and Gianna. Emilio saw blood soaking through Giulietta's uniform, and he had to grip the edge of the desk because the rage rising in him wasn't the cold, calculated anger he used in business. This was the primal fury of a man watching his children threatened, and the person protecting them hurt while he couldn't do a thing. Then Regina pulled her phone from the dress pocket, and Emilio watched the most terrifying performance he'd ever seen in his life, more terrifying than the times real enemies had stared into his eyes and sworn they were innocent right before a sentence was read. Regina dialed 911, lifted the phone to her ear, and in less than a second her voice transformed completely from ice-cold to trembling panic. "Please help me. Please send someone now. I'm at the Verano estate, 472 Lakeshore. The nanny attacked me. She has a weapon. I think it's a sharp ceramic shard. She's threatening the children. I don't know what she'll do next. Please hurry." Her voice broke exactly where it needed to break. Her breathing hitched exactly where it needed to hitch. Tears welled at the precise moment they were supposed to. A performance that, if Emilio hadn't had the camera, he would have believed down to every syllable. Giulietta heard the call from the corner of the room, where she was sitting on the floor holding the children, and Emilio saw her face go pale on the camera because she understood exactly what was happening. She knew that when the police arrived, they'd see a wealthy white woman with torn hair, ripped dress, bruises on her arm, crying, and a Mexican girl in a nanny uniform sitting in the middle of a wrecked room, and she knew what the outcome of that equation was in this country. But what truly made Emilio's skin crawl was the second call. Regina ended the 911 call, wiped her tears with the back of her hand as neatly as flipping a switch, then dialed another number, a private number, and her voice returned to its original ice. "Derek, I just called 911 to report an assault at the Verano estate," she said. "Make sure you're the one who responds to this call. I want that little nanny arrested on the spot and charged with assault with a weapon. I want her held without bail. My family will remember. You understand what I'm saying." Emilio heard every word through the microphone system. Derek. Sergeant Derek Malone of the Chicago Police Department, the name Franco, had once mentioned in a report about corrupt officers tied up with rival families, and now Emilio understood that this second call wasn't just the act of a jealous woman trying to ruin a nanny. This was the Ashford family activating a piece on the inside of the Chicago police force against someone under the Verano roof, and in Emilio's world that had one very specific name: betrayal. Emilio pulled out his phone and dialed Franco, his hand no longer shaking, because the tremor of fear had given way to the dead calm. Everyone who knew him understood was the most dangerous sign of all. Franco picked up after a ring. "Bring men to the house now," Emilio said, his voice flat as a lake before a storm. "Everything's changed. I need 4 men at the front gate and you at the main door. The police will be here in a few minutes, and one of them, a sergeant named Derek Malone, is Ashford. Handle him our way. And Franco." Emilio paused. "There's a girl in the living room holding my children. She's not the enemy. She's the only one protecting them. Keep her safe. That's an order." Giulietta heard Regina end the second call, and in the few seconds of silence that followed, she saw her future as clearly as a sentence already written. The police would come. They would see a white woman from the Ashford family crying with bruises and a torn dress. They would see a Mexican girl in a nanny uniform sitting in the middle of a wreckage of shattered ceramics and soapy water, and they wouldn't need to hear a single explanation before they snapped cuffs on her, especially with the sergeant in charge already given orders. She knew she could run. The back door by the kitchen led to the garden, and from the garden she could climb the east fence into the alley that connected to Lakeshore. She'd memorized that route without meaning to over the last 3 months every time she took the children out for air, but running meant leaving Noah and Gianna in this room with a woman who'd shoved an 18-month-old to the floor without even blinking. And to Giulietta, that wasn't an option. It wasn't difficult. It simply didn't exist in the universe of choices she lived in. So she didn't run. She did the exact opposite. Giulietta sat down in the middle of the living room floor, right on the broken ceramic pieces she swept aside with her forearm to clear a small, clean space, big enough for 2 babies, not caring that sharp edges scraped her skin through the torn uniform fabric. Then she pulled Noah and Gianna into her lap, set both of them on her thighs, and turned her back completely to Regina, as if that woman had been erased from the world Giulietta was building for the children. Noah was still hiccuping through sobs, his face red and soaked, and Gianna clung to Giulietta's collar with 2 tiny, trembling hands. So Giulietta bent close to their ears and whispered, "Let's play the cover your ears game. Jules will sing, and you cover your ears and only listen to Jules, okay? Don't listen to anything else." Then she started to sing. The song didn't have a name. It was the melody Rosa had sung to her when she was 14 and curled up on her bed after her father's funeral. It was the melody Rosa had sung again when she was 16 and sitting beside her mother's hospital bed in the emergency room of a public hospital. It was the melody Rosa had sung every night for years after that, when the orphaned girl couldn't sleep because of nightmares. A Spanish lullaby with no fixed words, only soft sounds Rosa invented to match the breathing of the granddaughter in her arms. And now Julieta sang it to two children, who weren't Rosa's blood, but needed her more than anyone. Julieta's voice trembled on the first notes, because her throat was tight with tears. But by the second line it steadied, gentle, warm, low, and even like a cradle song drifting in from somewhere far away and very old. And Noah stopped hiccuping, his wet eyes slowly closing, his fingers still clutching her apron but his body already going soft. And Gianna loosened her grip on Julieta's collar and curled into her chest like a kitten, finding the only warm place in a cold house. Regina stood behind them, staring at the scene with disbelief on her face. "You're singing," Regina said, half laughing, half sneering. "You're about to go to jail and you're sitting there singing. You really are crazy." Julieta didn't turn around, didn't stop singing. She only spoke between two lines of the lullaby in a calm that felt almost unreal. "Call whoever you want. The police, the army, whatever. But the last minutes I have in this house will be peaceful for the children. I won't allow their last memory of me to be your screaming." Then she returned to the lullaby as if the conversation had never happened. Dozens of kilometers away, on Interstate 90, Emilio was driving his black Maserati Levante through Chicago's evening traffic at 140 kilometers an hour, his left hand on the wheel, his right hand with the phone mounted on its holder. And through the car speakers, the sound from the camera system streamed live into the cabin. He heard Julieta's lullaby. That soft Spanish melody filled the leather-lined interior, mixing with the whistle of wind against the glass and the growl of the engine. And it tore Emilio apart in a way no bullet or blade ever could, because he was listening to a girl he'd almost ordered killed last night sing his children to calm with every ounce of love she had, while waiting to be arrested for a crime she hadn't committed. Tears blurred his vision. Streetlights and headlights ahead smeared into long streaks of light, and Emilio Verano, the man who hadn't prayed even on the day his mother was buried, even on the day Catherine breathed her last in the emergency room, whispered a plea aimed at no one in particular, aimed at the invisible emptiness above the highway. "Please let me get there in time. Please keep her safe until I get home. I'll fix everything. I swear I'll fix it." On another road cutting north, Franco sat in the back seat of a black Escalade with 4 bodyguards, phone to his ear, issuing a string of short, quiet instructions in the flat, emotionless voice of someone used to handling crises. And when one of the guards asked the priority level of the situation, Franco only said 2 words: "Level 1. And everyone understood that Level 1 in the Verano house meant be ready for anything. The black Maserati Levante tore through the iron gates of the Verano estate at a speed that made the guard jump aside and hit the barrier button without even managing a greeting. The tires ground over the white gravel drive that usually took Emilio 30 seconds to cross, but today he swallowed it in less than 5, before slamming the brakes at the front steps, the nose of the car stopping less than a hand's breadth from a marble column. The engine still roared, because he didn't bother to shut it off. The door flew open, and Emilio lunged out, his tie crooked, his hair a mess from raking it back again and again, with a sweat-wet hand, his eyes bloodshot from tears, and from the rage that had heated him on Interstate 90, like raw steel in a furnace. He didn't look like the polished Mafia boss Chicago knew. He looked like a wild animal that had scented an intruder in its den. He shoved the front doors with both hands. The heavy oak slammed into the wall with a crash that made the painting in the foyer shudder. His footsteps hammered down the stone hallway like war drums, and before he even reached the living room, Regina appeared in the doorway, eyes glossy with manufactured tears, hair ruined exactly as designed, Valentino's sleeve torn exactly where she'd ripped it, and she launched at him like a guided missile. Both hands shot out and clamped around Emilio's right arm, nails scraping his suit fabric, her mouth already running the script before her body even reached him. "Emilio, thank God you're home. She attacked me. She's crazy. I was so scared. The children almost got hurt. You have to throw her out right now. Call Franco to handle her." But Emilio had heard that voice twice already today. Once through the fake 911 call, and once through the call to the corrupt sergeant. And now, hearing it come out of her mouth in front of him in flesh and bone, it felt so false it made him nauseous, like smelling rotten food wrapped in pretty paper. Emilio looked down at Regina's hands, gripping his arm, at those perfect polished nails scratching his suit, and pure disgust spread from the point of contact through his entire body. He didn't yank away. He didn't shove her back. He did something far worse. Slowly, he lifted his left hand and peeled Regina's fingers off his sleeve one by one, thumb and forefinger on each, like picking a slug off clothing, with a cold contempt so sharp it seemed to thicken the air around them. "Don't touch me," Emilio said, and it wasn't a shout, it wasn't a bark, it was a low, rough murmur from the bottom of his chest that anyone in Chicago's underworld would recognize as the last sound before someone disappeared from the earth. Regina froze, her hand still hovering in the empty space where Emilio's arm had been, her eyes widening for the first time not in performance but in real confusion, because for months she'd said anything, and Emilio had believed her. She cried, and he held her. She frowned, and he asked what was wrong, and now his reaction didn't exist in any script she'd prepared. Emilio walked past her without looking, his shoulder brushing hers as if she were a ghost, an object, air, and he went straight into the living room, to the place his eyes had been searching for from the second he crossed the threshold. He saw Julieta. She was in the farthest corner from the doorway, her back against the wall, sitting on the floor amid broken ceramic shards and spilled soapy water, both babies clutched tight to her chest. The bright yellow rubber gloves were smeared now and scuffed, with a mark across the back of her right hand, where a Louboutin heel had pressed. There was dried blood on her leg where a ceramic fragment had sliced through her uniform, and her eyes were shut tight. She didn't see Emilio come in because she was waiting for footsteps to approach, waiting for a hand to grab her by the collar and haul her up, waiting for an order from the man she knew, the man she understood all too well knew how to handle problems. And in her head, it wasn't fear for herself that filled the space. It was a prayer. "Please let someone kind take care of the children after I'm gone. Please don't leave them with that woman. Please let someone tell Rosa I'm sorry I couldn't send dialysis money this month." Emilio saw all of it on her closed face. He read the resigned fear of someone who'd been treated so cruelly by the world for so long she no longer expected anything else, and it pierced him deeper than any bullet ever could. He didn't kneel, not yet, because the wail of police sirens was already rising somewhere beyond the gates, and he needed to stand. He needed to stand between Julieta and whatever was about to walk through that front door. So he placed himself directly in front of her, his back to the living room, his face toward the entrance, his broad shoulders blocking her and the babies from Regina's line of sight as she stood rigid on the other side, and he became the wall, a wall of flesh and bone. And this time, it wasn't Julieta shielding the children. It was Emilio shielding all of them. He didn't turn to look at her, but he spoke low enough that only she could hear, his voice raw and breaking on the last word. "No one's going to touch you. I'm here." Julieta opened her eyes. The police sirens tore through the late afternoon in the Gold Coast the moment Julieta opened her eyes and saw Emilio's back planted like a shield in front of her, and at the same time, from the opposite direction, the engine of a black Escalade turned in through the gates, 4 figures stepping out in quick, precise motions and fanning to positions around the front of the house without anyone needing to point, because they'd drilled this formation hundreds of times. Franco stepped out last, adjusted his coat collar, and walked straight through the front door with the steady stride of a man who never hurried but always arrived exactly when he needed to. 2 squad cars pulled up behind the Maserati that was still running, 4 doors opening at once, but only 2 officers moved toward the house. The one in front was a young man with a hard face, one hand resting on his holster the way protocol demanded when a weapon had been reported. Half a step behind him came Sergeant Derek Malone, expression carved from stone, but his eyes flicking fast to either side as he took in Franco's 4 bodyguards standing like statues on both sides of the steps. And Emilio knew immediately from the way Malone walked that he was weighing whether the job Regina had handed him was worth doing under these conditions. "Chicago police, whoever's inside, come into a visible area." The young officer called from the front doorway Emilio had left wide open, and Emilio stepped out of the living room into the foyer, calm, both hands raised to shoulder height, palms open forward in the universal posture any American who understood the law knew to take when police entered a home. "I'm Emilio Verano, the homeowner," he said, his voice even, each word clean. "I'm unarmed. There's no threat in this house. And I have video evidence showing the 911 call you received was completely staged." The young officer stopped to assess, eyes sweeping past Emilio into the living room where the wreckage was visible. Broken ceramic shards, spilled soapy water, a blonde woman with ruined hair standing on the left with a panicked face. And in the far corner, a girl in a nanny uniform sitting on the floor holding 2 babies. Malone pushed up shoulder to shoulder with the younger officer. He'd already identified Julieta and started moving toward her, his hand reaching behind his back for the cuffs clipped to his belt. "Sir, we received a report of assault with a weapon. I need to separate the suspect first. Then we can review evidence." But Emilio didn't shift a single inch from the position he held between Malone and the living room. "Sergeant," Emilio said, still polite, but every word heavy as lead, "I respect your procedure, and I'm asking you to respect my rights as the homeowner, to present evidence before anyone in my home is touched. The video is less than 10 minutes. You can watch it right now on the screen in the living room. If after you watch it you still want to arrest someone, I won't interfere. But I think you'll want to arrest the right person." The young officer looked at Malone, then at Emilio, then nodded, because legally the request was sound, and because the instinct of a new cop told him something about this scene felt wrong. The room looked too clean for a weapon assault. The woman claiming victimhood stood too far from the children she said she was protecting. And the girl being accused was holding the babies with a gentleness no criminal could fake. Emilio turned back into the living room, picked up the remote from the coffee table, switched on the 85-inch television mounted on the main wall, then opened the security app on his phone and cast it wirelessly to the screen, and suddenly the room filled with images so sharp you could count dust motes drifting in the sunlight. The footage began from the moment Regina entered the living room, and everyone watched. On the screen, Regina appeared with that cold walk, her insults slicing through the television speakers like blades. "Poor brain," "pathetic thing." Then the red-soled Louboutin pressed down on Julieta's hand, in a close zoom. The third-angle camera had captured so clearly, you could see the bright yellow rubber flattened under the sharp heel. Then Noah crawled over to show his toy car, and Regina's shove looked even more brutal on the giant screen than it had on Emilio's phone. An adult hand slamming into the shoulder of an 18-month-old, a tiny body flipping backward onto marble, a scream blasting through the surround sound and ricocheting off the walls until the young officer clenched his jaw, and even Malone had to turn his face away for a second. The video kept rolling. Regina in front of the mirror, deliberately wrecking her hair, deliberately pinching bruises into her arm with sickening precision, tearing her dress, smashing the ceramic statue. Then the 911 call, with flawless sobbing that clashed violently with the ice-cold face the camera showed. And finally the second call, Regina's flat voice ordering Derek Malone to arrest Julieta and charge her with assault with a weapon. "My family will remember. You understand what I'm saying." And Malone's name echoed through the speakers. And the young officer slowly turned his head to look at his colleague, with an expression Malone understood meant everything had just changed. The living room went silent. Regina stood on the left with her back against the wall, her face white as chalk, her mouth open but no sound coming out, because for the first time in her life she didn't have a script for this situation. The young officer spoke first. "Mr. Verano, what I just watched shows clear signs of staging a scene and making a false report under Section 721 of the Illinois Criminal Code. I'm going to write this up and recommend an investigation." Then he turned to Malone. "Sergeant, I think we need to have a private conversation about that second call in the video." But Malone didn't get the chance to answer, because Franco appeared beside him like a ghost, one hand dropping onto the sergeant's shoulder with a friendliness that wasn't real, and his mouth leaned close to Malone's ear and whispered a few words no one else could hear, except Malone. But the effect of those words showed instantly on the sergeant's face. His skin went from red to gray in less than 2 seconds. His pupils tightened, his jaw locked. He stepped out from under Franco's hand, walked to the door without another word, got into his car, slid into the driver's seat, and waited. Emilio turned to Regina. She was still against the wall, fingers digging into the wallpaper as if the floor had tilted. And when her eyes met Emilio's, for the first time she saw something in his gaze she'd never seen directed at her before. Nothing. Not anger, not sorrow, not hatred. Only the total emptiness of someone who had erased her from existence. "You have 2 choices," Emilio said, his voice flat, not a ripple in it. 1. You leave Illinois within 24 hours. You disappear from my life and my children's lives, and in exchange, this video stays locked in my safe where no one sees it. 2. You stay. And tomorrow morning, the video and the recording of you ordering Sergeant Malone will be sitting on an FBI desk because buying police is a federal crime, not a state one, and no Ashford lawyer can make that go away. And I'll make sure your father gets a copy the same day." Regina stared at Emilio, looked at the young officer writing his report, looked toward the door where Franco stood with his arms folded and 4 shadows behind him, then looked down at Julieta, still on the floor holding the babies, and Julieta didn't look back with hatred or triumph. She looked at Regina with the sad eyes of someone watching a miserable creature destroy itself, and it was that pity from the poor nanny Regina despised that finally pierced the armor of Regina Ashford's pride. "I'll go," Regina said, her voice shaking, no longer resembling any version Emilio had ever heard, her hand snatching her Hermes bag from the armchair, her feet unsteady and red, sold Louboutins as she staggered out of the living room through the foyer toward the front door, each step faster than the last until it turned into a run, the sharp heels clicking on marble, fading, then cutting off completely when a car door slammed and an engine roared as she left the Verano estate for the last time. Franco watched her go, lifted a hand to the wireless earpiece, and said tersely, "Follow her. Report every hour until she's on a plane." Then he turned back and gave Emilio a single short nod that meant, "It's done, boss." The young officer finished the false report paperwork, handed it to Emilio to sign, nodded, and walked out, the movement pulling along Sergeant Malone, who was already waiting in his car with the face of a man who had just watched his career and freedom hang by a thread. The squad cars left in silence, no sirens, no lights, and the Verano estate sank into its first quiet since Regina Ashford had stepped into the living room that afternoon. The front door closed behind the young officer, and for the first time in hours there were no clicking heels, no screaming, no sirens, no ceramic breaking, no crying, nothing but the heavy quiet of a house that had just survived a war and was learning how to breathe again. Franco stood in the main foyer looking into the living room, assessing the scene with the eyes of a man who'd served the Verano family for 20 years, then silently pulled the living room doors shut from the outside, giving Emilio and Julieta privacy without anyone needing to ask for it, because Franco always knew when his boss needed protection and when his boss needed to disappear. Inside the living room, the afternoon sun had shifted from honey gold to deep orange, pouring through the floor to ceiling glass and laying a warm light over the ruin, a gentleness that contradicted the destruction beneath it. White ceramic shards glittered on the marble like bone fragments. The soapy water had begun to dry into cloudy streaks. The bucket lay tipped on its side. The Persian rug had been shoved off-center, and in the middle of all that chaos, Julieta had started cleaning. Emilio stood a few steps away, watching her hold Gianna, asleep on her shoulder from exhaustion, with one arm while the other reached down to pick up shard after shard and tuck them into the fold of her apron. Noah was curled on the rug beside her, fast asleep too, his thumb in his mouth, and Julieta cleaned not because anyone told her to, but because it was what she knew how to do. It was the reflex of someone who'd spent her whole life cleaning up other people's messes and didn't know how to stop, even when she was the one being crushed by the mess. "I'm sorry for the mess, Mr. Verano," Julieta stammered without looking up, her voice raw from crying and singing. "I'll clean everything right away. I'm sorry about the statue. I know it was expensive. I'll pay it back out of my wages if you let me do it in installments. And the floor, I'll mop it again. I just need to set Gianna down and then I'll—" Her stammer cut off because Emilio moved. He didn't step. He dropped. His right knee hit the floor first, then his left, right into the soapy water and the sharp ceramic pieces. The dark gray suit pants soaked through instantly. A shard sliced the fabric, and maybe the skin underneath, but Emilio didn't flinch. He knelt until he was level with Julieta's eyes, and for the first time in 3 months since the day she'd entered this house, they looked at each other without the distance of someone standing above and someone kneeling below, only 2 people on the same plane, both wet, both dirty, both carrying injuries caused by someone else. Julieta recoiled when she saw him kneel. Her first instinct was to retreat, because in her experience, when power moved closer from a low posture, it was often to strike from an angle she couldn't dodge. But Emilio didn't raise his hand. He offered it, palm up, and waited. She stared at that hand, the hand that had signed the order to install cameras to watch her, the hand that had held a whiskey glass while ordering her to scrub floors on her knees, the hand she'd believed this morning would be the last thing she saw before everything ended. And now it was open in front of her, not clenched, not threatening, only waiting. Julieta placed her left hand in his, still inside the dirty yellow rubber glove, and Emilio closed his fingers gently around it, careful, like holding a butterfly. Then, with his other hand, he reached up and began to peel the left glove off. He did it slowly, sliding his fingers under the rubber at her wrist and rolling it down. The rubber stretched, then released, separating from her skin with a small damp sound. And beneath it, Giulietta's bare hand appeared, red, the skin dry and cracked from being soaked in soap and chemicals all morning. Her fingertips were slightly swollen. Her nails were trimmed short and clean, but the cuticles were peeling from dehydration. Emilio set the left yellow glove on the floor between them, then took her right hand and did the same, easing the second glove off. And when the rubber slid from the back of her right hand, he saw the deep red imprint where Regina's Louboutin heel had pressed. Unbroken skin but bruising already blooming, and his hand paused for a beat, his thumb instinctively brushing the mark as if tenderness could erase it. Then he set the second glove beside the first on the floor, the two yellow gloves lying between them like shed snakeskin, and his gaze moved from her hand to her wrist, to her forearm, and stopped. A scar. A long line running from the middle of her left forearm up toward her elbow. The skin pulled slightly off its natural line, paler than the surrounding flesh, the trace of an old wound that had healed but never disappeared. Emilio stared at it, and his jaw tightened. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous in a way Giulietta hadn't heard before. Not anger aimed at her, but the voice of someone searching for a name to add to a list. "It's old Mr. Verano," Giulietta said, trying to pull her hand back, but Emilio didn't let go, not gripping hard, only holding her firmly enough to make her understand he was asking for a real answer, and he needed it. "My previous employer," she admitted at last, eyes dropping to the floor. "My family has worked for powerful families like yours for generations. The lady of the house threw a glass at me because she said I stole her silver bracelet, but I didn't take it. Later, they found it under the sofa cushion, but I'd already been fired, and the cut had already turned into a scar. It doesn't hurt anymore. It's really fine." Emilio looked at the scar, at her cracked hands, at the bruise on the back of her right hand, at the dried blood on her shin where the ceramic had sliced through her uniform. Then he looked up at her face, exhausted, eyes swollen and red from crying, yet still beautiful in the way truth is always beautiful. No lipstick, no silk, no costume required, and he felt every wound on her body like an indictment of every person who'd ever held power over her and abused it, including him. "From today," Emilio said, and his voice fractured in the middle like cracked glass, "everything that's ever hurt you matters to me. All of it. Even the things you say don't hurt anymore. Even the things you've had to endure so long you forgot you never deserved them." Giulietta lifted her head and looked at him, really looked, for the first time meeting his eyes without lowering hers, and there was the confusion of someone hearing an entirely new language. Emilio didn't release her hand. He held it a little tighter, just enough for her to feel warmth press through the rough skin, and he went on. "I'm sorry, Giulietta. I'm sorry I made you scrub the floor on your knees this morning like you weren't human. I'm sorry I looked at you through poisoned eyes and saw an enemy where there was only someone who saved my children. I'm sorry I nearly let you be destroyed by a lie that I should have seen through from the first second if I hadn't been blind. And more than anything, I'm sorry I was one of the people who hurt you. I'm no different from that woman who threw a glass at you. I just used words instead of glass. But the cut is the same." Giulietta couldn't speak. Tears slid silently down her cheeks and dropped onto his hand where he was holding hers, and Emilio bowed his head, rested his forehead against the back of her cracked bare hand, closed his eyes, and stayed there. The forehead of a Mafia boss pressed to the hand of a nanny, an image no one in Chicago's underworld would ever believe if they saw it. And yet it was more real than anything Emilio had done in years. Gianna stirred against Giulietta's shoulder, making a small sound in her sleep, and Noah turned on the rug seeking warmth, and between two sleeping children, among shards and drying soap, between two yellow rubber gloves, lying on the floor like relics from an old life that had just ended, two people knelt facing each other in silence. And for the first time since Catherine died, this house felt something that resembled peace. 2 weeks after the night, the yellow gloves lay on the floor among the shards. The Verano estate had changed. Giulietta had her own room beside the children's room. There was no more gray uniform, no more white apron. Rosa had been transferred to Northwestern Memorial for dialysis 3 times a week, under Dr. Calloway's supervision, paid for by Emilio, and every time Giulietta tried to bring up repaying him, Emilio only looked at her and changed the subject. But the new piece was still raw skin, and tonight a summer storm off Lake Michigan ripped it open, Thunder shook the foundation. Lightning turned the bedrooms into a haunted photo studio, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, a sharp, strangled cry sliced through the wind and down the hallway, snapping Emilio awake from a dream where he was standing in a hospital corridor listening to Catherine's heart monitor flatten into a straight line. He ran barefoot to the nursery and froze in the doorway. Gianna lay in her crib, face burning red, sweat soaked, her little body arching up and slamming down, and the sound coming from her mouth wasn't normal crying. It was a harsh, barking cough threaded with a metallic wheeze every time she tried to breathe in. Her airway was closing. Emilio lifted Gianna into his arms, the heat of her fever transferring into his hands like touching a stove, the baby girl trembling as she fought for each swallow of air, and he stood in the middle of the room holding his child while his feet wouldn't move because memory hit him like a wave. Catherine had breathed like this before she stopped breathing. He had stood helpless like this then too, and the fear of losing one more person paralyzed the Mafia boss who'd once controlled hundreds of men. Acute laryngitis. Giulietta's voice cut through his panic from the doorway, calm and clear. She'd woken at the crying, hair loose, barefoot, but her eyes fully alert. She stepped closer, pressed the back of her hand to Gianna's forehead, then tilted her head and listened to the barking cough, with the focused concentration of half-finished nursing training she'd never been allowed to turn into a diploma. The pressure change from the storm triggered it, she said. Her larynx is swollen, so she's struggling to breathe. We need steam right now. Take her into the main bathroom. Turn the hot water all the way on. Close the door tight. Hurry, Emilio. For the first time since his father died, Emilio took an order from someone and obeyed without a second of hesitation. He carried Gianna into the white marble bathroom, cranked both hot taps all the way, sealed the glass door, and the room became a steam chamber in less than a minute. Giulietta sat on the closed toilet lid, took Gianna, positioned her forward on her lap to open her airway, one hand supporting her back, the other rubbing her chest in slow circles, breathing slowly and exaggeratedly so the baby could match the rhythm. The hot steam slipped into the inflamed airway, loosening the lining, and after a few minutes the barking softened, the wheeze eased. Gianna still had a fever, but she was breathing deeper, her eyes drifting shut from exhaustion. Emilio slid down onto the wet floor with his back against the wall, sweat, steam, water, and tears mixing on his face, watching Giulietta keep his daughter alive through the danger and feeling useless and grateful at the same time. Then, Giulietta began to hum, not the Spanish lullaby she'd sung that afternoon, but a different melody. Wordless, only simple notes repeating like a sleep spiral, and by the third note, Emilio felt as if he'd been punched in the chest, because he knew that melody, as well as he knew his own heartbeat. Catherine had written it, sitting at the grand piano in the last months of pregnancy, recording it into a small wooden music box she'd placed in the baby's crib. And after Catherine died, Emilio had shoved the box to the very bottom of the toy cabinet, because hearing that melody felt like being cut open alive. That song, Emilio whispered, his voice breaking. How do you know it? Giulietta stopped humming, looked at him, and understood. I found the music box in the toy cabinet, she said softly. Gianna wouldn't stop crying, but every time I opened it, she calmed down right away. So I memorized the melody to sing when the box wasn't near. I didn't know it belonged to anyone. I'm sorry if I shouldn't have. Emilio couldn't answer. He bowed his head, covered his face with both hands, and cried, not silent tears but the held-in sobbing of an entire year breaking loose at once in a bathroom filled with steam. And Giulietta didn't say a word. She simply kept holding Gianna, now sleeping peacefully, and kept humming Catherine's melody, letting that song soothe the daughter to sleep, and also giving a father permission to grieve the mother without anyone judging him. And she understood that tonight, she hadn't only saved Gianna from acute laryngitis, she had saved something Emilio had buried with Catherine, and believed he would never be able to dig up again. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving Chicago's sky clear as washed glass, and the Verano estate garden lush and bright, water beating on the leaves under the first sunlight. On the back porch, Agnes had laid out breakfast, sliced fruit, pancakes, orange juice, and a pot of hot coffee. But the difference wasn't the food. It was where people sat. Giulietta sat to Emilio's right, not standing behind him waiting for orders, not eating hurried leftovers on a side chair in the kitchen, but sitting beside him at the same table, with the two children tapping plastic spoons on their high chair trays. She wore an olive linen dress Agnes had bought, hair loose over her shoulders and still slightly damp from her shower, no apron, no gloves, Just a 27-year-old woman eating breakfast in the morning sun, and that normalcy, after everything that had happened, was the most extraordinary thing of all. Emilio picked up the coffee pot and poured into Julieta's cup before pouring his own, a gesture so small it was almost invisible, and yet it shattered the order that had ruled this house for 3 months, because for those 3 months Julieta had poured for him, and now he poured for her, and when she stared at the cup and then up at him with confusion, he only said, "Coffee gets cold fast. Drink." They ate amid Noah's babbling laughter as he tried to stick a piece of banana into Gianna's ear, and Gianna shrieked in protest. The little girl was completely fine after the night before, only her voice still a little hoarse, and inside that happy noise, Emilio looked at Julieta and asked in a gentle tone she'd never heard him use before, "Tell me about you, not about work or the children's schedule, but about you. Who is Julieta Marin?" Julieta set her coffee down, looked out at the garden for a moment, then told him, without melodrama, without polishing anything, in the steady voice of someone who'd lived with suffering long enough that it had become fact instead of tragedy. Her father had been shot and killed in a grocery store robbery on the South Side when she was 14. He'd only been standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The bullet hadn't been meant for him, but he died anyway. Her mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer 6 months after the funeral, and she died when Julieta was 16. Rosa, her grandmother, sold everything she could sell to raise her, and Julieta enrolled in a community nursing program on a partial scholarship. But when Rosa became sick with kidney failure, Julieta had to leave school and work as a nanny because it was the only job that paid enough to survive and cover hospital bills. The 2 families before Verano had both falsely accused her of stealing so they could fire her and keep her end-of-month pay. The scar on her arm was a gift from the second lady of the house, who'd thrown a glass at her over a silver bracelet that had fallen under a sofa cushion and been blamed on Julieta. When Julieta finished, she looked at Emilio and said, "I'm not telling you so you'll pity me. I'm telling you because you asked." Emilio stayed quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on its saucer. Then he said, "Dr. Calloway will check on Rosa weekly from now on, and I'll cover all treatment costs. No limit, no end date." Julieta shook her head immediately. "No, Mr. Verano, I can't accept that. It's too much. I'll find a way to repay you over time." Emilio set his cup down and met her eyes. "This isn't charity, Julieta. It's a debt. You saved my children from Regina. You saved Gianna last night. You kept Catherine's song alive in this house when I'd buried it. There isn't an amount of money that can repay those things, but I can make sure the woman who raised you into who you are today doesn't die because there isn't money for dialysis, and that's what I'm going to do whether you agree or not." Julieta opened her mouth to argue again, but she saw in Emilio's eyes what she'd seen the night before on the bathroom floor. Not the pity of a rich man handing something down to a poor girl, but the determination of someone trying to do right after doing wrong too many times, and she closed her mouth, gave a small nod, eyes wet. "Thank you," she said. Only 2 words, but the way she said them made them heavier than any speech. Emilio reached his hand across the table, not gripping hers, only resting his hand beside hers on the wooden surface, an invitation with no pressure. And after a beat of hesitation, Julieta placed her hand on top of his, bare skin against bare skin, no yellow rubber between them anymore, and they both felt a small current run through the contact point, warm and clear as the sunlight washing over the table, and neither of them pulled away. The weeks that followed passed, and the Verano estate changed, not with hammers or fresh paint, but with things much smaller. Emilio started coming home earlier. At first it was only 30 minutes earlier, then an hour. Then some days he canceled an entire afternoon meeting, and Franco only lifted an eyebrow and didn't ask. Each time Emilio came back, he didn't go straight up to the second-floor study anymore. He went straight to the living room, where Julieta was on the rug playing with the children. The first time Emilio sat down on the floor beside his son, he sat stiff as a plank, not knowing where to put his hands or his legs, and Noah looked at him like a stranger, then turned and crawled toward Julieta, and Emilio felt like he'd just been rejected by his own child in the cruelest way on earth. But Julieta didn't let him sit there alone. She placed a wooden block for building towers into his hand and said, "Build it and Noah will come knock it down. Just keep doing that. Kids like breaking things more than building them." And Emilio built towers with hands that had signed $1-million deals, and Noah crawled over and shoved them down laughing. Then Emilio built again, and Noah knocked them down again, and again, and again. And by the 5th time, Emilio was laughing too. Giulietta taught him how to change diapers, and he did it wrong 3 times in a row until Noah protested at full volume. She taught him how to warm formula to the right temperature by testing it on the back of his hand. She taught him bedtime stories by changing his voice for each character, and he tried to voice a dragon, and it came out sounding like Franco. So Giulietta burst into laughter and had to cover her mouth so she wouldn't wake Gianna, who had just fallen asleep. He discovered that he laughed at home more than anywhere else, more than in boardrooms, more than in clubs, more than in any room he'd walked into since Catherine died. One night, the children were fast asleep, and Emilio sat in the library with a whiskey, reading financial reports, while Giulietta sat across the room in an armchair, legs tucked up, reading an old nursing textbook she'd kept from before she'd dropped out, the spine frayed and peeling, pages dog-eared and marked in pencil. The desk lamp cast a warm light over her face, and Emilio realized he'd stopped reading his report at some point. He was only watching her, watching the way she frowned when a passage got difficult, the way her finger tracked the lines, her hands still rough even without rubber gloves, the scar on her left arm visible under short sleeves, and he thought she was beautiful. Not beautiful like Regina with Silk and Valentino, but beautiful because she was real, because every scar and every callus on her hands told the story of someone who didn't quit, and those rough hands were holding his world together. "Giulietta," he said. She looked up from the book at him through cheap reading glasses bought at a drugstore. "I want to take you to dinner," he said. Not dinner at the kitchen table with the kids, but out. A dinner for 2 adults, as a man who wants to know a woman, not as an employer and a nanny. Giulietta took off her glasses and stared at him for a long time, and he saw the battle in her eyes between what she wanted and what she believed she was allowed to want. "Emilio," she said, and the fact that she used his name instead of Mr. Verano made his heart skip. "Your world and my world are very far apart. I'm a nanny from the South Side and you're—" She hesitated, searching for a polite way to describe what he was without naming it. "You're you. That distance doesn't disappear because of one dinner." Emilio set his whiskey down, leaned forward, met her gaze, and said, "You stood in front of a woman who wanted to destroy your life, and you didn't take one step back. You raised a hand in a yellow rubber glove to block a slap because my children needed you. You sat in the middle of broken shards and sang a lullaby when you knew you were about to be arrested. What distance on this earth could stop me after what I've seen you do?" Giulietta opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Noah's sleepy voice drifted from the nursery down the hall, a babbling little call from inside a dream. "Mama." Only one word, tiny and half asleep, but it fell into the library's silence like a stone dropping into still water. Giulietta sprang up on instinct, then froze mid-motion, staring at Emilio with panic because she'd always feared this moment, feared he would be angry that his son had called her by the most sacred name that should have belonged only to Catherine. But Emilio smiled, warm and sad at the same time, then nodded toward the hallway and said, "Go. Your boy's calling his mom." The dinner Emilio had promised never happened, because 3 days after that night in the library, Franco knocked on the study door 3 times and walked in with a face Emilio had learned to read over 20 years, a face Franco had only brought to him 3 times before, and each time someone had died or was about to die. "We have a problem," Franco said, setting a burner phone on the desk beside Emilio's silver-plated gun. "My network up north intercepted an encrypted call between Kowalski's people and a number in New York. That number belongs to Regina Ashford." Emilio looked at the phone, then at Franco, and Franco continued in a flat, emotionless voice, but each sentence landed heavier than the last. "Regina contacted the Kowalski family from New York and gave them the layout of the Verano estate security system she'd memorized while living here. Camera placements, the old gate codes, the guards' patrol schedule, and most importantly, the weekly routine where Giulietta took the twins to see Dr. Calloway every Wednesday morning, the fixed route, an unarmored vehicle, only a driver. Kowalski planned to stop the car on the empty stretch between the estate and the clinic, kidnap Noah and Gianna, and use the children as leverage to force Emilio to concede in the Northern Territory negotiations the 2 sides had been deadlocked on for months. The planned date was Wednesday next week. Emilio rose slowly from his chair, both hands braced on the desk, and the silence that spread from him was the silence Franco knew better than anyone, the pause before a kill order. "Find her," Emilio said, his voice flat as a blade. "I want to handle it permanently." Franco nodded. But before he could turn to leave, the study door opened, and Giulietta stood in the doorway, holding the baby monitor she carried everywhere in the house. Her face drained white, and Emilio understood she'd heard everything through the monitor, because his study sat right beside the nursery, and radio signals sometimes crossed. Giulietta looked at Emilio, looked at Franco, looked at the silver-plated gun on the desk, then looked back at Emilio. "You can't," she said, her voice trembling but her eyes steady. Emilio's jaw clenched. "You don't understand. She wants to kidnap my children. She sold information about this house to my enemies. In my world that ends one way." "I do understand," Giulietta said as she stepped inside. "And I'm terrified, more than you think, because I'm the one sitting in that car every Wednesday with the children. But if you kill her, you'll become the very thing you're trying to protect your children from. Do you want Noah and Gianna to grow up knowing their father kills people to solve problems? Do you want them to inherit that?" The room went quiet. Franco stood motionless, watching Giulietta with an expression that said if anyone else had spoken to Emilio Verano like that, Franco would have intervened. But he didn't move, because he remembered warning Emilio about Regina and being ignored, and this girl was saying what he didn't have the right to say. Emilio looked at Giulietta, then at the framed photo on the desk where Noah and Gianna were grinning in a picture Agnes had taken last week. Then he closed his eyes, drew in a long breath, and when he opened them, the killing intent had softened. Not gone, but contained, and for the first time, he chose a different road. "Franco," he said, "Plan B. Contact Regina's father. Send him the video and the recording of her bribery call to Sergeant Malone, along with proof she sold internal security information to Kowalski. Tell him there are two options. 1. The Ashford family cuts Regina off completely and removes her from the United States permanently. 2. All evidence goes to the FBI the next morning and the Ashford name ends up in the papers next to words like accomplice and bribing federal officials. He has 24 hours. Franco nodded, and this time something like a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth before disappearing. "And Kowalski," Emilio continued, "neutralize the kidnapping plan before Wednesday. I don't care how, but not one hair on the children's heads gets touched. Change the entire security system. New passwords. New routes. An armored vehicle for every trip Giulietta takes with the children." From now on, Franco left the room, and 3 days later everything was done. The Ashford family chose option 1. Regina was cut off from every account and put on a plane to London with a suitcase, and not a dollar to her name. Kowalski's kidnapping plot was dismantled before it could begin, in a way Franco didn't report in detail, and Emilio didn't ask. That night the estate was locked down. Guards doubled their patrols. The new camera system blinked green in every corner, and Giulietta sat in the nursery in the rocking chair beside the crib, watching Noah and Gianna sleep, refusing to leave even after Agnes told her 3 times to rest. Emilio found her there at midnight after he'd gone through the entire security system with Franco. He stood in the doorway and watched her sitting in the darkness, with only a star-shaped nightlight casting patterns on the ceiling. Then he walked in without a word, pulled a small chair beside her rocker, and sat down. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. Emilio's shoulder touched Giulietta's shoulder, warmth traveling through thin fabric, and in the nursery darkness with the steady breathing of Noah and Gianna as the background rhythm, 2 people sat side by side guarding the most precious thing they both had, and it was the first truly intimate moment between them. Not hand-holding, not a kiss, only shoulder to shoulder in the dark, and the understanding that from now on, they stood on the same side. The digital calendar on the black oak desk showed the date, exactly 1 year since the afternoon when 2 yellow rubber gloves and a security camera system changed the Verano family's fate forever. Emilio sat in the same leather chair, in the same second-floor room where his hand had once trembled as he hit enter. But the man sitting there today was not the man from a year ago. The dark circles of sleepless nights were gone, replaced by the fine lines around his eyes that only show up on people who laugh often. His shoulders were no longer military rigid. They had softened, and on the desk beside the laptop, there was no half-finished whiskey at 3 a.m, only a framed photo Agnes had taken of 4 smiling faces in the backyard last fall. On the laptop screen, the cursor hovered over a folder named security.s file. Inside was everything. Regina's videos, the recording of her bribe call to Sergeant Malone, proof she'd sold information to Kowalski, all the weapons Emilio had held for a year like a shield in case Regina ever came back. But Regina never came back. She was somewhere in Europe living off whatever money remained in her wallet, and the pity of old acquaintances. The Ashford family had cut ties with Verano, but Emilio didn't care, because what he'd lost from the Ashfords wasn't a millionth of what he'd found in the south side of Chicago. Not needed anymore, Emilio murmured to the screen, then dragged the folder into the trash and hit permanent delete. A green progress bar filled, then vanished, and the last trace of Regina Ashford in this house dissolved into digital nothingness. Emilio closed the laptop, grabbed his coat, and left the office, greeting his secretary with a smile she wouldn't have believed was real a year ago, then drove home through Chicago streets, scattered with autumn leaves, yellow and orange across the sidewalks. When he opened the estate doors, the first thing that hit him wasn't sterile silence and the chemical smell of floor cleaner like it had been a year ago. It was warm cinnamon apple pie spilling from the kitchen, mixed with soft jazz and children's laughter coming from the living room. Emilio walked to the living room doorway and stopped under the frame, the way he'd stopped there in dreams many times, just to look without being seen for a moment. Late autumn sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass and laid the same honey gold tone over the cream Persian rug it had a year ago. But the rug was no longer spotless. It was scattered with toys, wooden blocks, a wooden train, teddy bears, a happy mess Emilio wouldn't trade for anything. In the middle of it sat Julieta. She was on the floor, legs stretched out in comfort, wearing a loose emerald green maxi dress that draped over her 7-month belly, black hair spilling over her shoulders and catching the light, and on her left ring finger, a platinum engagement ring with a blue sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds, threw little flecks of sunlight onto the ceiling. The ring Emilio had designed himself because he wanted it to carry the same quiet elegance as the woman wearing it, not the hollow show he'd once mistaken for sophistication. Noah and Gianna, now nearly 3, 2 little tornadoes in t-shirts and shorts, ran circles around her trying to build a wooden tower, knocking it down, laughing, repeating, the game Julieta had taught Emilio months ago, and now the children played with each other without needing anyone to guide them. From the kitchen, the cinnamon apple scent grew richer, and Rosa's soft Spanish singing drifted out. She'd been healthy under her treatment plan at Northwestern Memorial, and now lived with the family in the ground floor room Agnes had arranged, becoming an unofficial grandmother who spoiled the children with sweets and fairy tales in 2 languages. Emilio stepped into the light. "Papa!" Noah shouted first, and then Gianna, "Papa! Papa!" And both of them flew toward him like 2 little bullets wrapped in laughter. Emilio dropped to his knees, opened his arms, took the impact of 2 small bodies, held them tight, kissed Noah's head, then Gianna's, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo mixed with cinnamon apple, and thinking this is what peace smells like. Then he stood and went to Julieta, offering both hands to help her up because 7 months pregnant made standing from the floor a workout. And when she was steady, he placed one hand on her belly. Under the emerald fabric, a small kick landed against his palm, clear and alive, an unborn daughter saying hello to her father. He looked at Julieta. Julieta looked at him, and in the middle of children's laughter and cinnamon and golden fall light, no words were needed, because everything that mattered had already been said by that small kick beneath his hand. Emilio gently took Julieta's hand and led her out of the living room toward the library at the end of the hall, the room with the thick Persian rug, the ceiling-high shelves of old books, and the red brick fireplace where they'd sat together for the first time on the night the gloves were taken off. And when Emilio closed the door softly behind them, Julieta realized he was hiding something behind his back. "Sit down," Emilio said, pulling out a chair for her because 7 months pregnant meant she couldn't stand for long. Then he walked to the bookshelf, took down a small hand-carved wooden box, about the size of a palm, the kind people used for precious jewelry or family keepsakes, and placed it in her hands. Julieta looked at the box, looked at Emilio, then opened the lid. Inside, resting on black velvet, weren't diamonds or pearls. It was the yellow rubber gloves, the old gloves, washed clean, but still scratched across the back of the right hand. And right in the center there was a small half-moon indentation, where Regina's red-soled Louboutin heel had pressed down, a mark faded by time but not erased. Like the scar on Julieta's arm, like every real wound, they heal, but they never pretend they didn't happen. Julieta touched the gloves with her fingertips, feeling rubber that had dried and stiffened compared to the day she'd worn them, and scrubbed the floor on her knees, and she looked up at Emilio with a question in her eyes. "Why did you keep this?" she asked. "They're just trash." Emilio sat in the chair across from her, elbows on his knees, leaning forward, and said, "Sometimes when I'm in boardrooms signing million-dollar contracts, or when we go to events and you're in a gown so beautiful I forget how to breathe, I get afraid. I'm afraid I'll forget, that I'll turn back into the man who only saw the uniform and not the human inside it, that I'll turn back into the blind man who sat in a closed room, believing a liar, while the person telling the truth was on her knees downstairs, scrubbing the floor." He glanced at the gloves in the box, then met her eyes again. "These gloves remind me of the day I almost lost everything. They remind me that real love doesn't wear silk and perfume. It wears a gray uniform, rubber gloves, and kneels on a cold floor and still sings lullabies for someone else's children. They remind me that the bravest person I've ever met wasn't any gunman in my organization. It was the girl who raised a hand, wrapped in yellow rubber to block a slap and protect 2 children who weren't her blood." Emilio took Giulietta's hand. Her hands were softer now than they'd been a year ago, because she no longer soaked them in chemicals. But they still weren't the hands of a sheltered princess, and he loved that. "I'm keeping these gloves," he said. "So when our daughter grows up, I can tell her the story of the mother who saved this family with her bare hands, so she'll know she comes from a line of women warriors, not a princess in an ivory tower. So she'll know Grandma Rosa spent her life sacrificing to raise her mother, and her mother sacrificed everything to protect her brother and sister, and that strength runs in her blood, and no one can take it away." Giulietta looked at the gloves, looked at the sapphire ring on her finger, looked at her belly where their daughter was kicking, then looked at Emilio, and tears slid down her cheeks, but she smiled. A real smile, the smile of someone who finally believed she was allowed to be happy. Emilio leaned in, lifted his hand to her face, wiped her tears with his thumb, then kissed her, gentle and slow, no rush, a kiss not burning or frantic, but warm and deep and full of promise, like a vow that didn't need a church. The library door flew open with the familiar bang, and Noah shot in like a tiny bullet, shouting, "Grandma's finished baking." And Gianna wobbled after him, clutching her teddy bear, the glass eyes that no longer hid any camera. And behind the children, Rosa appeared in the doorway, gray hair neatly pinned up, apron dusted with flour, holding a tray of hot cinnamon apple pastries, smiling and mixing Spanish with English, as she said, "I tried to keep them back, but once they smell sugar, nobody can stop them." Emilio laughed, released Giulietta but kept holding her hand, then said, "I think all of us want dessert." And the whole family spilled into the big dining room, where Agnes had already set bowls and plates for 6 people, even though there were only 3 adults and 2 children, because the 6th place was always set for the one who was coming. They sat together, Rosa at the head of the table cutting the pastries, Giulietta beside Emilio, Noah and Gianna in high chairs banging spoons on their trays demanding their share, and laughter and voices filled the room that a year ago had held only silence and the smell of floor wax. Up on the dining room ceiling, in the corner where the smoke detector met the molding, the small security camera still blinked green, still recorded, still uploaded to the cloud. But if someone opened today's footage, they wouldn't find evidence of crime or betrayal or violence. They'd find a family eating cinnamon apple pastries in warm yellow light, a grandmother smiling, 2 children with cinnamon sugar smeared across their faces, a man looking at the woman beside him with the eyes of someone who'd walked through darkness and found his way home, and a pregnant woman smiling with hands no longer wrapped in rubber gloves but still carrying the calluses of someone who'd worked her whole life, hands that were now holding the hand of the man who a year ago had ordered her to scrub floors on her knees. And both of them had forgiven each other, and both of them had chosen each other, and that was the miracle. Emilio reached up and turned off the dining room light when dinner ended. Rosa had taken the children upstairs. Giulietta rested her head on his shoulder in the hallway, and the house fell into darkness, but it wasn't dark, because the light in the Verano estate no longer depended on lamps or sunlight. It came from inside, from laughter, from lullabies, from the scent of cinnamon, from the kick of an unborn daughter. And that light, born from truth and forged in forgiveness, would never go out. Today's story ends here, but before we part, I want to share something. Emilio and Giulietta's story reminds us that sometimes the most important person in our lives isn't the one wearing the nicest clothes, speaking the prettiest words, or coming from the fanciest place, but the one who stays when everything collapses, the one who lifts a hand to shield our children when we aren't there, the one who sings lullabies among broken pieces when she knows she's about to lose everything. And sometimes the bravest thing isn't holding a weapon, it's putting the weapon down, not taking revenge, but forgiving, not clinging to power, but kneeling before someone who deserves it. I want to ask you, What part of this story touched your heart? Have you ever met someone like Julieta in your life? Someone who sacrifices quietly and never demands credit? Share your story in the comments below, because I read every comment, and I truly want to hear what you feel from deep in your heart. If today's story made you feel something, please hit like to support the channel. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe and turn on notifications, so you don't miss new stories every day. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days beside the people you love. Thank you for being here with me today. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.